it dozens of times since moving in, usually when I was getting dressed or reaching for my jacket. But I wasn't near the closet. I was standing on my mattress in the center of the room. The sliding stopped, leaving behind a silence that felt heavier than before. I strained to listen, my ears becoming hypersensitive in the darkness. That's when I heard it. Soft, rhythmic, barely audible, like someone breathing on the other side of the hanging clothes. My rational mind immediately began constructing explanations. Old buildings settle. Temperature changes cause materials to expand and contract. The ventilation system could create air currents that might move things. The heating had kicked on earlier, and maybe thermal expansion was causing the track to shift. But my body wasn't listening to my rational mind. My heart rate had accelerated, and a thin film of sweat was forming on my palms despite the cool October air. I found myself holding my breath as if making noise might attract attention from whatever was, or wasn't, in my closet. I reached up again for the pull chain, fumbling in the darkness. My fingers found it, tangled around the socket, and I worked to free it. The metal was surprisingly warm to the touch, as if it had been handling heat rather than just hanging there. When I finally got it loose and pulled, I heard the distinctive click of the switch engaging. Nothing happened. No light. No gentle illumination of my familiar space. Just the same impenetrable darkness, and that faint sound of breathing from the closet. I pulled the chain again. Click. Still nothing. The breathing sound had stopped. Panic started as a small flutter in my chest like a trapped bird. I needed to get out of this room, needed light, needed to see what was happening. I climbed down from the mattress, my feet touching the cold hardwood floor, and began moving toward where I remembered the door to be. In the darkness, the geography of my own apartment had become foreign. The distance between my bed and the door seemed to stretch, and twice I had to stop and reorient myself when my outstretched hands met walls instead of the doorframe I was seeking. My fingers traced along the exposed brick, feeling the rough mortar between the blocks, following it like a lifeline toward what I hoped was the exit. When I finally reached the door and stepped into the hallway, the fluorescent light there seemed blindingly bright. I stood blinking, my eyes watering from the sudden transition. The normal sounds of the hanging clothes. I approached slowly, the flashlight beam dancing with the slight tremor in my hand. The metal track showed no obvious signs of damage or displacement. The door moved smoothly when I tested it, sliding open and closed with the same familiar scraping sound I'd heard earlier. Inside, my clothes hung exactly as I'd left them. Jeans, t-shirts, the one good shirt I wore to conferences. My winter coat at the far end. Nothing disturbed, nothing out of place. I pushed the clothes aside, checking the back wall of the closet. Solid plaster, painted white, with no cracks or gaps. But as I moved the clothes, they swayed in a way that seemed excessive for the gentle pressure I'd applied. And when I let them settle back into place, they continued swaying for several seconds longer than they should have. I closed the closet door firmly and returned to the ceiling fan. In the flashlight beam, I could see that the chain had somehow rewound itself around the socket in a complex series of loops. It took me several minutes to untangle it, during which time I became increasingly aware of the silence behind me. Not the normal quiet of an empty room, but an expectant silence, as if something was waiting. When I finally freed the chain and pulled it, the light flickered once and then steadied, flooding the room with warm yellow illumination. I looked around, half expecting to see something out of place, some evidence of an intruder or explanation for what I'd experienced. Everything looked normal, completely, perfectly normal. I told myself it had been a moment of disorientation brought on by the sudden darkness, a combination of stress from my thesis work, too much caffeine, and the power of suggestion. Old buildings make odd sounds. Objects settle and shift. Memory can play tricks, especially in moments of stress or fear. But as I prepared for bed that night, I found myself avoiding looking toward the closet. And when I finally did glance in that direction, I could have sworn the door had moved another inch. I got up and checked it. Firmly closed. I pushed against it to make sure the track was properly seated. It didn't budge. Lying back down, I stared at the ceiling fan slowly rotating above me. The pull chain swayed gently in the breeze it created, a hypnotic pendulum motion. I must have watched it for an hour before I finally fell asleep. I woke up at 3:17 a.m. to the sound of the closet door sliding open. This time I didn't move. I lay perfectly still listening. The door had opened wider than before. I could tell by the duration of the scraping sound. And then came the breathing again, more distinct now, as if someone was standing just inside the closet, partially concealed by my hanging clothes. The breathing was too measured to be accidental air movement, too rhythmic to be a mechanical sound. In, out, patient and steady, like someone trying very hard to be quiet. I reached slowly for the flashlight on my nightstand, trying not to make any sound that might indicate I was awake. My fingers closed around the metal cylinder, and I clicked it on, swinging the beam toward the closet in one quick motion. The door was closed, completely, perfectly closed, exactly as I'd left it. But the breathing sound continued for another 3 seconds before fading away. I kept the flashlight on for the rest of the night, sweeping it around the room every few minutes, checking the closet door, looking for any sign of movement or change. Nothing. The door remained closed. The closed bar was still. The room was exactly as it should be, except for the breathing, which I heard twice more before dawn. Always when the flashlight beam was pointed away from the closet, always stopping the moment I turned toward the sound. When morning came, I called in sick to my research assistantship. I spent the day trying to find rational explanations, researching everything from building settlement to auditory hallucinations brought on by stress. I checked the closet obsessively, measuring the door's position, looking for any mechanism that might cause it to move. I found nothing. That evening I considered staying somewhere else. The university had counseling services, and part of me wondered if I should talk to someone about what I was experiencing. Sleep deprivation could cause hallucinations. Stress could manifest in strange ways. Maybe I was having some kind of breakdown brought on by the pressures of graduate school. But another part of me, a part that was growing stronger as the day progressed, insisted that what I was experiencing was real. The sounds were too consistent, too specific to be random hallucinations. And there was something else, something I couldn't quite articulate, a sense of presence that seemed to intensify whenever I was in the room. As night fell, I made a decision. I would stay awake and observe. I would document everything, approach it like the researcher I was training to become. If this was psychological, then systematic observation might help me understand what was triggering these experiences. If it was something else, I didn't want to finish that thought. I positioned myself on the mattress with a notebook, pen, and flashlight. The overhead light stayed on. I would not allow myself to be trapped in darkness again. At 11:43 p.m., the light bulb burnt out. Not the dramatic pop and flash of a bulb blowing, but a gradual dimming, as if someone was slowly turning down a rheostat. Within 30 seconds, I was back in that familiar suffocating darkness, and immediately, I heard the closet door begin to slide open. This time I didn't reach for the flashlight. I sat perfectly still and listened. The door opened wider than before, much wider. I could hear the soft whisper of fabric as something moved among my hanging clothes. Not the random sway of garments in a breeze, but the purposeful displacement of someone moving through them. The breathing was clear now, close enough that I could distinguish the intake from the exhale, could hear the slight whistle of air through what might have been a nose or partially closed lips. And then, cutting through the darkness with terrible clarity, came the sound of footsteps on my hardwood floor. Not the creaking of old boards settling, but the distinct pressure and release of weight moving across the room. Slow, careful steps, as if someone was trying to move quietly, but couldn't quite eliminate the sound entirely. The footsteps moved from the closet toward my mattress. I gripped the flashlight but didn't turn it on. Some primitive part of my brain had decided that as long as I couldn't see what was making the sounds, it couldn't see me either. A child's logic, but it was all I had. The footsteps stopped about 3 feet from the edge of my mattress. The breathing was right there now, close enough that I should have felt air movement on my skin, close enough that the sound had a quality of immediate presence that no hallucination could replicate. I waited, every muscle in my body tense for whatever was going to happen next. Nothing happened. The breathing continued, steady and patient. The presence remained, so tangible I could almost feel it pressing against the darkness. But nothing touched me. Nothing spoke. Nothing moved closer. We waited there together, me and whatever shared the darkness with me, in a strange, terrible equilibrium. I don't know how long we remained like that. Time had become meaningless in the absolute dark. Finally, the breathing began to fade, not moving away, but diminishing, as if whoever was there was slowly disappearing rather than leaving. The footsteps resumed, retracing their path back toward the closet. I heard my clothes rustle as something moved among them. Then the soft scrape of the closet door sliding closed. Silence. I turned on the flashlight. The room was empty, exactly as it should be. The closet door was closed. I got up and checked it, firmly seated in its track, impossible to open without deliberate effort. I left the apartment that night and stayed at the university library until it opened the next morning. When I returned, everything was normal. The light bulb worked perfectly. The closet remained closed throughout the day, but I knew with absolute certainty that when darkness fell again, I would not be alone in that room. The question that haunted me as I sat in the library's fluorescent brightness wasn't whether what I'd experienced was real. It was whether it had always been there, waiting in the darkness, and I'd simply never been still enough in the silence to hear it breathing. Some presences, I was learning, don't need to be seen to be felt, and some realities exist only in the spaces between what we know and what we fear to discover. The studio apartment is still available for subletting. The rent is very reasonable. The musician never asked why I broke the lease so suddenly, and I never offered an explanation. I simply told him that the place had too much character for my taste. Some truths are too specific to be believed, too personal to be shared. All I can say with certainty is that I sleep better now in rooms with multiple light sources, and I always keep my closet doors open, because I've learned that it's not what you can see in the darkness that you need to fear. It's what can see you. Story 7. The first thing you need to understand about 14,000-foot peaks is that they don't forgive mistakes. The second thing is that sometimes, when you're up there, where the air thins to nothing and the world drops away beneath your boots, something watches you back. We'd started the climb before dawn, headlamps cutting weak cones through the darkness as we picked our way up the boulder field. My climbing partner, let's call him Jay, had been unusually quiet during the ascent, which should have been my first warning. Jay never stayed quiet for long, especially not when the altitude started getting to him, but I was focused on my own breathing, on the rhythm of step, rest, step that keeps you moving when your lungs are screaming for oxygen that isn't there. By the time we reached the summit, the morning sun had painted the surrounding peaks in shades of gold and crimson. The view stretched endlessly in every direction, ridge after ridge of Colorado's backbone disappearing into blue distance. We took our photos, ate our summit snacks, signed the register. Standard stuff. The kind of moment that's supposed to make all the suffering worthwhile. The descent started normally enough. We retraced our route down the talus field, boots finding purchase on loose rock that shifted and clattered with each step. But somewhere around 12,000 feet, the weather began to change. What had been a few scattered clouds in the morning evolved into something heavier, more ominous. The temperature dropped with startling suddenness, and the wind picked up, carrying with it the metallic scent of approaching storm. That's when we hit the cloud. It rolled up the valley like a living thing, gray-white tendrils reaching ahead of the main mass to test the terrain. One moment we could see the entire route spread out below us. The next, we were enveloped in a world gone white. Visibility dropped to maybe 10 feet in any direction. The familiar landmarks, the distinctive rock formation that marked the turn, the cairns that guided the way, all vanished as if they had never existed. Jay stopped ahead of me, his figure barely visible through the mist. When he turned back, his face looked strange, unfocused. "Which way?" he asked, and his voice sounded muffled, distant despite the fact that he stood less than arm's length away. I checked my compass, though the reading seemed to shift even as I watched. The needle wavered between directions, as if it couldn't decide which way was north. "This way," I said, pointing toward what I thought was the correct ridge. "We need to stay on the main ridgeline." But the cloud had disoriented us more than I'd realized. What looked like the obvious route down turned out to be a false ridge, leading us away from our intended path and into unfamiliar territory. By the time we realized our mistake, we were deep in an unknown valley, and the weather had turned truly vicious. The rain started as scattered drops, then transformed into something harder, more aggressive. Each droplet felt like a tiny steel pellet striking exposed skin. The wind howled through the peaks with a sound that seemed almost alive, almost intentional. And beneath it all was another sound, a low humming that seemed to emanate from the rock itself. That's when I tried the emergency radio. The device crackled to life with a burst of static so loud it made both of us jump. I held it close to my mouth and shouted over the wind, giving our approximate location and requesting guidance back to the main trail. For long seconds, there was nothing but white noise and the drum of rain on granite. Then a voice cut through the static. Not the crisp, professional tone of search and rescue, but something rougher, older. The words were barely distinguishable through the interference. "Descend until you find running water." That was it. No acknowledgement of our location, no request for additional information. Just that single instruction delivered in a voice that sounded like it was coming from somewhere much farther away than any radio tower had a right to reach. Jay looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. "Did that sound right to you?" Before I could answer, the thunder started. Lightning doesn't give you much warning in the mountains. The thunder follows so closely that you can almost feel the electrical charge in the air before the sound hits. But this was different. The intervals between flash and crash seemed to follow a pattern, a rhythm that was too regular to be natural. Like someone or something was counting. 1 Mississippi, 2 Mississippi, 3 Mississippi, crash, 1 Mississippi, 2 Mississippi, crash, 1 Mississippi, crash. We ran. Down through the unfamiliar valley we stumbled, following game trails and watercourses, our boots slipping on wet rock and sending loose stones clattering into the void below. The rain had soaked through every layer of our gear, and the cold was starting to seep into our bones. But worse than the physical discomfort was the growing sense that we weren't alone in this strange valley. It started as a feeling more than anything concrete, the sensation of being observed, of movement in the peripheral vision that vanished when you turned to look directly. The mist played tricks with depth perception, making distant objects seem close and near objects disappear entirely. But there was something else. Something that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up, despite the rational part of my mind insisting it was just the storm, and the altitude, and the stress of being lost. Shadows moved wrong in the cloud. They shifted independently of their sources, sliding across the wet rock like they were alive. And the sound that had started as a low humming seemed to be following us, staying just at the edge of hearing, but never quite going away. The glacial lake appeared suddenly, a black mirror reflecting nothing in the gray world around it. The water was perfectly still despite the wind, its surface so dark it might have been a hole in the earth rather than a body of water. We stood at its edge, both of us breathing hard, both of us staring at our reflections in that obsidian surface. "This isn't right," Jay said, and his voice sounded hollow, echoes bouncing strangely off the surrounding rock walls. "This lake shouldn't be here." He was right, of course. I'd studied the topographic maps extensively during trip planning. There was no glacial lake marked in this area, no body of water of this size anywhere in the vicinity of our intended route. But there it was, unmistakably real, unmistakably wrong. That's when I noticed our reflections weren't quite right either. The faces looking back at us from the black water seemed subtly different, features slightly askew. expressions that didn't quite match what we were actually doing. When I raised my hand to test the effect, my reflection seemed to hesitate a split second before following the motion. Jay's reflection appeared to be looking at something off to the side, even though Jay himself was staring directly down at the water. "We need to keep moving," I said, stepping back from the lake's edge. The wrongness of the place was settling into my bones like the cold, making every instinct scream that we should be anywhere else but here. The trail away from the lake, if it could be called a trail, was barely visible through the mist and rain. It wound through dense forest where every tree seemed positioned to catch and channel the storm's electrical fury. The trunks were scarred and blackened from repeated lightning strikes, and more than once I caught myself thinking that they looked less like trees and more like massive antennas, conducting some invisible signal between the earth and sky. 5 hours. That's how long it took us to cover ground that should have taken 2 hours at most. Every step forward felt like we were walking deeper into something we didn't understand, something that was actively working to keep us lost. The forest seemed to shift around us, paths appearing and disappearing, familiar landmarks becoming alien the moment we passed them. Jay started talking to himself somewhere during the 3rd hour. Not loudly, just a constant murmur of words I couldn't quite make out. When I asked him what he was saying, he looked at me with wide, unfocused eyes and insisted he hadn't been saying anything at all. But I could still hear it, that low muttering that sounded almost like a prayer, almost like an incantation. The feeling of being watched intensified as the day wore on. Movement in the peripheral vision became more frequent, more bold. Something was pacing us through the trees, staying just out of sight but never quite falling behind. I caught glimpses of it sometimes. A darker shadow among shadows, a suggestion of form that vanished the moment I tried to focus on it. But it was the trees themselves that bothered me most. Every single one looked like it was waiting for something. Their branches reached out over the trail in configurations that seemed too purposeful to be accidental, creating a canopy that felt more like a web than natural growth. And the scarring on their trunks, those black, twisted marks from lightning strikes, began to look less random the more I studied them. They looked like symbols, like writing, like something was using the trees to communicate, burning messages into the bark with pure electrical fury. Messages in a language I couldn't read but somehow understood on a level deeper than conscious thought. They were warnings, or invitations, or maybe both at once. By the time we finally spotted our base camp through the trees, the storm had moved off to pummel some other range, leaving behind only the drip of water from overburdened branches and an oppressive silence that felt somehow more threatening than the earlier chaos. Our tent stood exactly where we'd left it, looking absurdly normal in the gathering dusk. But normal was exactly what it wasn't. I noticed it first when I went to retrieve my trekking poles from where I'd left them leaning against a boulder. The familiar aluminum shafts felt different in my hands, heavier somehow, as if they'd absorbed more than just rainwater during our absence. But it wasn't until I examined them more closely that I saw the marks. Thin, dark lines traced along the metal like delicate tattoos. They hadn't been there when we'd started the climb. I was absolutely certain of that. I knew every scratch and ding on those poles from years of use. These were new, fresh, and they followed patterns that made my vision blur when I tried to focus on them directly. They looked exactly like the scarring on the trees, like something had kissed the metal with lightning, but selectively, purposefully, writing messages that my conscious mind refused to decode but my deeper brain understood perfectly. Jay's poles bore identical marks. "What do you think made these?" I asked, holding up one of the poles so he could see the strange scarring. He examined his own poles with the same growing unease I felt. Lightning, maybe? During the storm? But we both knew that wasn't right. Lightning doesn't write. Lightning doesn't trace careful patterns in metal. Lightning doesn't leave behind signatures that seem to shift and change when you're not looking directly at them. That night, neither of us slept well. Every sound in the forest seemed amplified, significant. The normal settling noises of cooling rock and shifting earth took on sinister overtones. And sometime during the darkest part of the night, I could have sworn I heard that low humming again, coming from somewhere outside our tent. When morning came, the marks on our poles had spread. New lines had appeared overnight, more complex patterns that spiraled up the aluminum shafts like metallic DNA, and they were warm to the touch, even though everything else in camp was cold with morning dew. We packed up quickly and started hiking out, neither of us speaking about what we'd seen. But the marks continued to evolve during our descent, becoming more elaborate, more intentional. By the time we reached the trailhead, they covered nearly the entire length of both sets of poles, creating intricate geometric patterns that hurt to look at directly. The strange thing was, nobody else could see them. The park ranger who checked us out at the trailhead examined our poles when I showed him the marks, but his expression remained politely blank. "I'm not seeing anything unusual," he said, running his fingers over metal that was clearly scarred with those impossible patterns. "Maybe some oxidation from the moisture. You might want to clean them when you get home." Jay couldn't see them either, not anymore. When I pointed them out during our drive back to the city, he looked at me with genuine concern and suggested I might need to see a doctor. According to him, the poles looked exactly as they always had, standard aluminum trekking poles with the normal wear patterns from years of use. But I could still see them, still can see them. The marks are changing, evolving, becoming more complex with each passing day. They've started appearing on other metal objects in my house, the stair railings, the kitchen knives, the frame of my reading glasses. Always the same delicate lightning kiss patterns, always warm to the touch. And sometimes, late at night when the city is quiet and the electrical grid hums with its own mysterious energy, I can hear that sound again. That low humming that seems to emanate from the metal itself, carrying messages in a frequency just below the range of human hearing. Messages that I'm beginning to understand. The thing about 14,000-foot peaks is that they don't forgive mistakes. But sometimes, if you make the right kind of mistake in exactly the right place, they give you something else instead. Something that follows you home. Something that marks you as its own, using the language of lightning and the alphabet of electrical fire to write itself into your world, one metal surface at a time. I've been thinking about going back to that valley, the one that doesn't appear on any map, with its impossible lake and its antenna trees. I've been thinking about those symbols burned into bark and metal, about voices that speak through radio static and shadows that move independently of their sources. Because I'm starting to suspect that what happened up there wasn't about getting lost at all. I think something found us, and I don't think it's done with us yet. The marks are spreading faster now. They appeared on my car this morning, traced along the metal door frames like silver veins. My neighbor's dog won't come near me anymore, and electronic devices malfunction when I get too close. The fluorescent lights in my office flicker whenever I walk beneath them, and my computer screen displays strange patterns for split seconds before returning to normal. Jay hasn't returned my calls in weeks, but I don't need to talk to him to know he's experiencing the same thing. Because last night, when the humming was particularly loud, I realized I wasn't hearing it through my ears at all. I was hearing it through the metal, through the marks, through whatever it was that kissed our poles with lightning and left its signature in aluminum and steel. And now, as I write this, I can feel it writing back. Story 8. The first thing I noticed about the Stonington rental wasn't the peeling paint or the musty smell that clung to everything like a second skin. It was the television. A massive CRT monitor sat in the corner of the living room, its gray plastic casing yellowed with age, the screen dark and reflective as black water. When I flicked the power button that first evening, expecting nothing more than static, green text materialized against the void. Hello. I assumed it was some quirky screensaver, a relic from the early days of computing when such displays were novelties rather than necessities. When I turned it off 3 hours later, having found only dead channels and white noise, different text appeared. Goodbye. Cute, I thought. Retro charm. The house had been a steal, too good to be true, really, for a place just minutes from the Connecticut coast. The landlord, a nervous man who spoke in quick, clipped sentences, had been eager to rent it furnished. He'd mentioned something about the previous tenant leaving abruptly, but I hadn't pressed for details. I needed somewhere quiet to finish my novel, somewhere removed from the city's constant digital hum. and this place offered exactly that kind of isolation. The silence here was different from urban quiet. It pressed against the windows like something alive, broken only by the distant crash of waves against the rocky shore and the occasional groan of old wood settling. At night, the house breathed around me, floorboards expanding and contracting, pipes ticking behind walls, the refrigerator humming its mechanical lullaby. I established a routine quickly: coffee at dawn, writing until noon, then long walks along the shoreline where salt spray stung my face and gulls wheeled overhead like scattered thoughts. The CRT became part of that routine, its morning greeting and evening farewell bookending my days with an odd sort of consistency. But routine has a way of making the unusual seem normal, until something shifts just enough to remind you that normal was never quite right to begin with. The phone call came on a Tuesday, 3 weeks into my stay. I'd been deep in a particularly difficult chapter when the old rotary phone, another charming anachronism, began its mechanical ringing. The caller ID, such as it was on the ancient device, showed only blocked digits. As I reached for the handset, the CRT across the room flickered to life. "Don't answer," my hand froze halfway to the phone. The screen pulsed once, twice, then went dark. The ringing continued, insistent and hollow in the quiet house. After 6 rings, it stopped. I stared at the television for a long time, my heart doing something irregular against my ribs. The rational part of my mind, the part that had gotten me through graduate school and 2 published books, suggested a power surge, some kind of electrical feedback from the old wiring. Old houses were notorious for their quirky electrical systems, but rational explanations felt thin in that moment, like tissue paper in a downpour. I called my agent that afternoon, needing to hear another voice, to anchor myself in the familiar world of deadlines and contracts and mundane professional concerns. We discussed the manuscript's progress, potential publishers, the usual business. Near the end of the conversation, I found myself mentioning the house's peculiarities: the old phone, the antique television, the general sense of stepping back in time. "Sounds like the perfect writer's retreat," he said, and I could hear him typing in the background. "Reminds me of that Shirley Jackson place up in Vermont. Complete isolation, no distractions. Just you and the work." After hanging up, I realized I hadn't mentioned the morning's incident with the television. It seemed too absurd to voice. Too much like the beginning of a story I might write rather than something that had actually happened. The next strange occurrence came 2 weeks later, during a conversation with my brother. He'd called to discuss our parents' estate. Our father had passed the previous year, leaving behind a house neither of us wanted to maintain. We'd been going back and forth about selling it for months, the decision complicated by sentiment and practicality in equal measure. "Look, you're the one living like a hermit up there," he said, his voice crackling through the old phone's receiver. "You've got time to deal with realtors and inspections and all that crap. I'm drowning here with work and the kids." I was pacing the living room as we talked, watching the sun set through the salt-stained windows. The conversation had been going in circles, both of us reluctant to be the one who finally pulled the trigger on selling our childhood home. Action, I learned, was not the same as silence. The first message appeared 3 days later, etched in thin white lines across the dark screen like frost on a window. I'd been sitting at my laptop, struggling with a particularly stubborn paragraph, when peripheral vision caught the ghostly text materializing on the unplugged display. "They're watching." I approached the television cautiously, as if it might bite. The letters were definitely there, burned into the screen's surface like old phosphor damage, but with a clarity that suggested recent formation. When I touched the glass, it was warm. My hand jerked back as if I'd been shocked. The screen was completely disconnected from any power source, yet somehow generating enough heat to feel almost feverish against my palm. I called the landlord that afternoon, describing the television's odd behavior in the most neutral terms I could manage. He listened with what sounded like forced patience, occasionally making non-committal sounds that might have been agreement or dismissal. "Old electronics can be funny," he said finally. "Probably just residual charge in the capacitors. These old CRTs hold power for a while even when they're unplugged." Nothing to worry about. But his voice carried an undertone I couldn't quite identify. Not quite fear, but something adjacent to it. When I pressed him about the previous tenant, he became evasive, mentioning only that the man had been very interested in electronics and had left rather suddenly. Did he leave any other equipment? I asked. A long pause. Nothing that worked. That night I dreamed of wires, endless tangles of copper and plastic snaking through the walls of the house, connecting nothing to nothing.